The Convergence.fm podcast team is taking a break in the month of August, but we'll be back with new episodes in the fall. Until then, Ashok wants to share one of his favorite episodes starring Ben Foster of Prodify, who opens up about building hardware-enabled subscription products and crossing the product-market chasm. We'll be back in September with a set of new episodes on fostering engaged teams who ship delightful products. Thanks for watching and for listening. Here's the show.
Welcome to the Convergence podcast. I'm your host, Ashok Shivanan.
Customers are going to say, hey, I wish the screen was bigger. I wish that, this and that, and whatever that means in your product. And you're going to have to say, no, we're not going to go do that. This product is what we want it to be. We're not building for customer solution fit. We're building for product market fit.
On this show, we'll deconstruct the best practices, principles, and the underlying philosophies behind the most engaged product teams who ship the most successful products. This is what teams are made of. Welcome back, folks. On this episode, I am rejoined by Ben Foster. Ben might be one of the most tenured product folks that I get to nerd out with. He's been working in product since the early 2000s, including for Marty Kagan at eBay from 2001 to 2005. Ben is the co-founder of the Prodify group and also the co-author of the book, Build What Matters. We ended up nerding out so much during this recording that we split this episode up in two. And you are here listening to episode 2 out of 2 with Ben Foster. On the first episode, we talk a lot more about how to craft a product roadmap, how to communicate a vision and a strategy to your team to generate excitement, and also when it comes to leading and managing teams, some of Ben's advice on how to hire and how to train and enable your product managers. On this episode, we're going to switch gears, talking a lot more about hardware, especially around Whoop, my favorite fitness wearable, and where Ben served as a chief product officer. There's a lot of nuances that come into play with respect to road mapping, strategy, when it comes to having a piece of hardware in your customer experience. And Whoop went on to even have their hardware sold as a subscription versus having a big upfront cost. So you can imagine there's a lot of tough decisions there, and we get to hear a lot more about that. If you haven't heard the first episode, make sure to go check that out. I hope you enjoyed this one. I got to learn a ton from Ben. If you're an aspiring chief product officer or you're looking to understand more of the constraints and the opportunities that your product team has, I think you'll learn a lot from Ben too. Hope you enjoy the episode. Let me know what you think in the comments. Subscribe to the podcast to get future episodes as soon as they're published. If you find this helpful, give the podcast a 5-star rating on your podcast app or hit that like button on YouTube. I'm curious, one of the things we work on is not just the product frameworks, but also the product team frameworks. And, we used to do separate server and client teams or front end and back end teams. And the concept of full stack came around, and firmware and hardware was still like folks on the other side of the fence that you would, depending on the culture of the organization, being cursing back and forth and complaining about the grass being greener on the other side. I'm curious to know what the team organization was like at a very innovative company like Whoop to drive kind of fast product delivery.
Yeah, the reality is the medium in which you're working is just so radically different that you really do have to have separate teams. Like, you're not going to have, an engineer who floats back and forth one sprint versus the next, working on software versus working on platform capabilities versus working on hardware or firmware. So people get, trained in specific areas. They're working on, certain hardware capabilities. They're doing electrical engineering. They're looking at battery life and things like that. So you have sort of your hardware team, you have your firmware team that are kind of like independent, and then you have your set of software teams. And software is much more sort of like fuzzy and fungible, and there's a lot of things that you can do with that in terms of team organization. But I do think that it was kind of like critical to separate those things out, because the way in which they need to work and the way that they even need to think and the planning cycles and things like that are just so incredibly radically different. But that was kind of like part of the challenge from a leadership point of view as well, is because I don't want to break things down that way. I don't think of the world as, well, there's the hardware and there's a completely independent pillar here of the firmware, and there's a completely independent pillar of, the software, because all these things, like we said, lead to this one thing that you're actually trying to deliver. The product in Whoop's case is not a device. It's not an app. It is a membership. And the membership contains all of these things, but they need to kind of like play nicely together to support what the value of that membership is going to be. So you had to have a sort of, I guess, clarity on what the future version of that membership was going to be, and then allow the teams to kind of interpret what that meant for them and what requirements were going to be really important to meet and where innovation should be invested in. But there's this really interesting kind of thing that happens in hardware too, in terms of the innovation pipeline, and the way that works is a bit different than on the software side, because sometimes, especially for bleeding edge capabilities like, a Whoop device, which has, miniaturization and so many other things kind of like built in, you're really on the cusp of what physics allows, given what we know about those things today. You're at the cusp of, the absolute maximum, energy you can get from a battery of a certain size, and so on and so forth. So there's this research pipeline where you're saying, okay, I want to invest in battery life. I want to invest in these types of sensors. I want to invest in, seeing what we can do with miniaturization, or what we can do with temperature control, or, things like that. And you have these kind of like parallel paths of innovation, and each of these different kinds of teams are looking at that stuff. And then you have a point where you say, okay, we need to release a new version of the hardware. And obviously this is not a thing that you're doing every 2 weeks the way you might in software or something like that. You might be doing it every 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, etc. So you've got to make some sort of a cut on that and say, okay, which things are actually ready for prime time and which things are not. And given the things that we have been investing in, the things that are ready for prime time, okay, those are the things we're going to put into this device. And we sort of look at that holistically and would say, is sufficient? Is that going to be interesting in the market? Is it going to be differentiated, versus the other wearables that are out there, et cetera? Are there a lot of cool features in the app that we can have that link to this, that we can build within that time frame? So it kind of requires all this stuff to come together and to come to a consensus on, okay, this is what the requirements that's going to be. We believe that we're ready on these. But there are teams that are working on just continuing to innovate, and like they almost don't even care what the cut line is for the hardware, because they're just doing R&D type work to see what's possible. And some other team is responsible for shipping this particular version of the device. And that's sort of not where we started from a process point of view, but it's the direction that we took. And I think it's very similar to the kind of thing that you imagine that Apple or, anybody else sort of has this similar kind of approach of, they're doing all this research and all these different kind of like parallel streams of seeing what kinds of things are possible in terms of, haptic sensors and touch screens and, things like that. And then at some point they're going to say, okay, this is what the iPhone 13 is going to be. This is what the iPhone 20 is going to be, things like that.
Yeah. And I think, some of this is relatively obvious for me. I came from the IoT world before the word IoT. I worked at a startup that built this box that you could plug in any 24-volt manufacturing sensors into, and it converted that into SQL. And then, to your point, the hardware team was working on a very different roadmap than the folks who were taking the data off that database and getting to spin up different reports and drive different action to the folks on the shop floor. And then I think, cloud really took hardware out of the equation for a long time. And I have a hunch that it's going to come back, because with AI coming to the forefront, I feel like hardware and, like you said, physics maybe becomes a limiting factor for capacity and speed. I'm curious if there's something you've thought about around outside of IoT where hardware engineers may become cool again. I say this as an ex-hardware engineer.
I think they're very cool. It's amazing what kinds of things they're capable of creating, and it's really awesome. And it's amazing at Whoop how much I learned about the complexity involved in hardware. So you just look at a device and you're like, oh, it just works. And it's like, that's like looking at an organism and saying it just works. And you don't even understand that there's like this immune system that's built in, and, same kind of thing basically happens with hardware. So it's always more complex than you realize on the surface. But yeah, I think that there's a lot of capabilities for new IoT products, and other kind of like hardware products and things like that. As you look at things that become more mainstream, where I think as a society, we're crossing the chasm. I think smart home capabilities. It's great that you have, Alexa and things like that. But like, okay, now the question is, given that you now have that capability to have voice control, then now suddenly there's more demand for the things for which you can control them with your voice, like your lights or your security or, things like that. I was just, interestingly having a conversation with my family about, we were just sort of asking, what do you think the home of the future is going to look like in 20, 30 years? And it was just really interesting. I kind of imagined that you might have video cameras around your home, not that you would have any sort of like, privacy, issue or whatever, but it's almost like you could ask questions like, tell me when I need to buy milk. Tell me when I need to, automatically place the orders for the things based on what you see available. Or, hey, where did I put my keys? You could actually have your house answer that question for you, because it could have watched you and be like, oh, you set your keys down over here, things like that. So, the capabilities are there. And I think that it's going to be the hardware that needs to now catch up to what the software capabilities are going to be, because these two things kind of, move in one takes a lead, and then the other one, has like pressure to catch up. And you see companies kind of like emerge, and there's plenty of, VC money that flows into it, et cetera. And I think that what we'll see on the other side of this AI investment that's going on right now is to say, okay, great, now we have all these capabilities, but like physically we're limited by what it can actually do. So let's start to see investments on the other end of that as well.
I think it was Roomba or iRobot that Amazon acquired, right? And all of a sudden makes so much more sense when you look at it in that lens.
Right.
Why they would buy vacuum cleaners. Fostering an engaged product organization and aligning them with the principles around lean, human-centered design, and agile will more than likely lead to successful business outcomes for your organization. But getting started or getting unblocked can be hard. This podcast is brought to you by the player coaches over at Integral. They help ambitious companies like you build amazing product teams and ship products in artificial intelligence, cloud, web, and mobile. Listeners to the podcast can head on over to integral.io/convergence and get a free product success lab. During this session, the Integral team will facilitate a problem-solving exercise that gives you clarity and confidence to solve a product, design, or engineering problem. That's integral.io/convergence. Now, back to the show. Subscriptions for hardware is another very novel thing. I have a pop quiz for you, actually, first. What do you think is the first smartwatch sold as a subscription?
Ooh. First smartwatch sold as
or
a
wearable.
Honestly, I'm not familiar with one that was sold as a subscription before Whoop, but I'm sure there must have been something out there.
It's not that surprising that you're not familiar, because one of the things that folks at Microsoft want folks not to remember is a device they had called a Spot, which worked off of FM radio signals instead of like Wi-Fi or 3G and stuff.
Oh, fascinating.
And then they charged like, I want to say $50 a year to get your software updates and stuff like that. So that didn't go quite as well as it has for Whoop. And as I understand it, Whoop's one of the only ones today that wearables that has like a subscription only plan, as opposed to an optional subscription on top of the one-time hardware. That bold move that has, I think, paid off. What do you think about hardware subscriptions, and what can you share from like anything around that decision of Whoop?
I think it's a great model if you can afford it, right? I mean, it was a bet the company move when Whoop put that out there, because, think about it monetarily. You have to have the upfront cost to manufacture these things, to hold them in storage, to ship them out, to replace them, etc. And somebody pays you even $30 a month, but it costs you a lot more. I can't disclose the specific numbers, but it costs you a heck of a lot more than that to manufacture this, right? So what you're really doing is you're taking a bet on the quality of the product that you're delivering. You're saying, this thing's going to be so good that I'm willing to gamble that I'm going to lose money on you if you throw it in the trash, put it in a drawer, return it, etc. Because now I'm stuck having manufactured this thing and I didn't even get the price, of building it back from you, right? So they have to stay customers for 6 months, a year, 18 months, whatever, to get you your money back. But the other side of that is that if you can deliver on that promise and people wear it for years and years and years, you're continuing to get that $30 every month, right? Or you're getting that $200 every year, or, whatever the price tag is for the product, of interest. And you also lower the barrier to entry to be so low. So, you're not having to spend $2,000 on a Peloton bike before you even do your first ride, right? And you can get it in people's hands that much more readily. So the opportunity for growth is really massive, but the importance of retention is also super massive. And it refocuses the company's attention on that. Now, a lot of people say, okay, that sucks because it's a consumer business and consumer businesses have notoriously, high churn and, it's bad from a business standpoint and things like that. But I got to say, as a product person, I loved that because what I didn't have anymore was this debate of, do I do the thing that's right for the customer or do I do the thing that's right for the business? Finally, I can say it's actually one and the same, right? Like I want to do those things that give customers such a great experience that they continue to want to pay us. Driving retention is the number one business metric. And it's also the artifact of having delivered that customer value that we were talking about in the beginning of this as well, right? So suddenly there's alignment between, the company's interest and the customer's interest. We want what you want. And that just made it so much easier to make good decisions. And I think it creates a much better and more and sturdier brand, to be honest.
There's so many places I want to take that. So many insightful nuggets there. So I'll try and remember all of them. So first one is the customer value and churn. Whoop, as I understood it, had at least as far as I know, two major segments. I saw folks like NBA basketball, players like Kyle Lowry that would wear them. And then I started to see it at my local gym. And that's kind of how I got involved with the enthusiasts. And I imagine, I don't even know if the NBA players look at their own data, if their trainers look at it. I imagine it's just very different use cases, right? So what is that like when it comes to that level of having to prioritize across the two?
Yeah. Oh man, you're opening such a great conversation here. Let's just take the conversation this direction because I think there's a lot of really good nuggets in here as well. So, every company gets to this stage if they're successful where they want to cross the chasm, and crossing the chasm is moving from those early adopters to mainstream. And what's interesting about that and what makes that so hard is that the things that are interesting, the things that are exciting to early adopters are often contrary to what those things are that are exciting to the mainstream market. And a good example of that would be novelty, right? So the early adopters, novelty is a feature. They love the fact that there's some new metric that they've never seen before somewhere else and things like that. But the majority of people are like, oh, it doesn't really make intuitive sense to me. I'm not going to take the time to learn that. You just got to make it make sense to me, right? And so there's actually a lot of investment that goes into it, but it does put you in a position where you have to decide, who are you sort of, optimized for to some extent. Now, there are ways through it, right? You can design a product where you can say, hey, here's the thing that's information that's available to everybody that everyone will find value from. And if you want to double click on it as an advanced user or NBA player in this case, et cetera, then there's this really, granular detail behind that, but it's behind a click. So it's not going to interfere with the experience for those people, but it's going to be available for those people. So, it leads to certain kinds of design decisions. But the Whoop thing was really interesting. I think when companies are trying to cross the chasm, they just sort of run into this brick wall and they don't really know why, and they don't really know what it takes to get through it. And I think that the thing that I learned at Whoop was that if you can break down your customer base and really identify how the persona is different in one case versus another, and you're willing to make those investments for those personas, then you can you can really be successful at continuing your growth beyond this point that stalls a lot of companies out. So I'll give you the example for Whoop. So Whoop started with the elite athletes, right? And it was in fact actually a B2B business in the very beginning, selling to the teams, and the team would buy the device for all of their athletes on the team, for all their players. And the data would go to, their trainers and things. And, you could imagine all kinds of privacy concerns and, who actually owns the data and stuff like this. But what was interesting about that was that those are the people who are the aspirational group for the next tranche, right? And that next group of people are the people probably like you, they're in gyms a lot. They, are really focused on their strength and their endurance and they want to be fit. Fitness is like their focus and things like that, right? Then you have a layer below that. And those people are the inspiration or their aspirational group for the people who are more sort of like health focused. And they want, this kind of experience that's going to help them to better manage their health. They care about things like longevity. They care about things like, do I have the energy that I want to have throughout the day? Things like that. And then even below that, there was a group of people who only cared about using Whoop because they want to hold themselves accountable and they want to make sure they go to bed on time. Hopefully that helps, health benefits and things like that. But I just want to kind of focus there. So what we did is we reversed this whole thing and we said, okay, there's actually a stack. There's like a ladder that you can climb. Everybody needs to care about being compliant. They actually need to do the things that they need to do. You're not going to improve your health or your fitness or your athletic performance or anything like that if you don't care about actually doing the things like getting to bed at a consistent hour, getting the exercise that you need, not overexerting yourself in the moments when you're sick, things like that, right? And so Whoop sort of became this great kind of coaching, model for that. And then based on that, if you do those things well, it will get you to be more healthy. And if you're more healthy, it'll help you to be more fit. And if you're more fit, it's going to make you perform that much better in your sport. And so we kind of like created this pyramid. And you don't see that anywhere in the product, but it lives behind the scenes. And it's really kind of like this structure that helps to inform, okay, here's how to think about these different products, these different features. And so let's take sleep as an example. Sleep is for somebody who just cares about their did they actually do it? Or are they sort of like holding themselves accountable? You just want to feed them the data back. Like the success is just going to bed on time. That is success in its own right. For those people who care about longevity and they care about their health outcomes, they want to make sure that they're getting, sufficient sleep as part of living a healthy lifestyle and that it's helping with their immunity, longevity, etc. For those people who care about their fitness, they want to make sure they're getting enough sleep because if they do get enough sleep, then it's going to help them to improve the quality of their workouts, which is going to make them more fit. And for those people who are then more fit is going to lead them to, having better athletic performance and, as like a high powered athlete. So what it made us realize is the way we used to think about sleep, which was it's just purely a means to an end. What matters is the athletic performance or what matters is the fitness, and sleep is just kind of like helping you get there. No, as you kind of like go down market, sleep becomes something that actually matters in its own right. And so you might not just ask a question of like, what are those things that are contributing to good or bad sleep, or how does sleep affect these other things? You might just say, what are the things that are actually affecting sleep? And so it kind of changes the nature of how you might design the product. And it's going to be really hard for you to grow your business, to think about expansion, if you don't have a good, solid, verified breakdown of the different kinds of personas along those lines and how you need to adapt the structure of your product to match the needs of a new persona that maybe you haven't been meeting before. That was a very long description. I apologize for the length of that, but hopefully there's some good nuggets in there as well.
I loved every second of it. And I've kind of always had a framework of, how many orders of separation are there between the input, like in this case, going to bed on time, and the outcome, right? Where if it's that first user you said, the input is the outcome, right? I go to bed on time, and I went to bed on time was what I was looking to do. This is something that just helps me manage it, hold myself accountable. And then, as you go up those chains, there's other there's other things that need to happen or other variables that come into play, which creates an opportunity for value every single time. What I'd never thought about is that you actually create a feedback loop in the first place, where it's not just did you go to bed on time, is did you do other things that gets you the best sleep as well, which now you're raising the bar of the person that wanted that input to outcome relationship. And I love it. And
you nailed it.
That's just a great story. I could probably talk about Whoop for another 2 hours, and I'll save everyone that, and maybe you and I can come back and talk about that. So you've worked directly with a lot of founders, including the founder of Whoop, I think, as an advisor before you joined. Is that right? So I get to hang out with some companies don't have a chief product officer yet, and the need for that role, the value associated, is still kind of emerging. These are maybe companies that are, maybe founded 15 years ago or so, or more. And there's a CTO though, and the CTO is in charge of kind of what today product folks have to do is translate a lot of that vision, apply validation to it, roadmap it, so forth. And say you're a CTO without that kind of product sense, and you've got a founder that just, as founders are, and I seem all over the place, seem really urgent, changing their mind, but in their minds, it seems like everything's super aligned, but to other folks, maybe it seems very contradictory. What's a piece of advice you might have to help them with creating a conversation with that founder where both parties feel like there's transparency and there's control, and ultimately just the founder is coming from the right place and the CTO is trying to solve the right problem and getting them both in tandem. So I'm curious to know if you've got any wisdom you could share with those CTOs out there.
Sure. I'll say this, even if you were a CPO joining the company for the first time, it's not like, you walk in the door and on day one, everybody totally gets it all of a sudden, right? Like you still have to do the job of explaining what the product mindset is and how the company needs to operate in a different way in order to make products successful. So there's a few things that I would point out, but the number one that's most important is understanding what it means to be a product company and how success is different in a product context than it is in a sales driven context. So a lot of times these companies from a while ago, the companies that never had a CPO, and, so if you're sitting there as a CTO in this role and, obviously they've had technology and they've been building things and you've been building things, et cetera, but you're realizing that there's this chance to build something that's going to have lasting value for future customers down the line. And you want the founder to have an appreciation of that. Usually what that translates to is stop saying yes to everything and start saying no to some things, right? Not everything, but some things. And it's really that nuance of when do you say yes to certain things? When do you say no to other things? And the key element there is that it's easy as a services company to say yes to everything. And in fact, that's how you grow, right? A client asks you for some, random thing, or, it's funny, like with Prodify, ironically, we are a services company helping product companies to be better with product, right? Mm-hmm. But the way we operate is we say yes to the different kinds of client needs, and we try to come up with ways that we can help them that are unique to them and their special circumstances and things like that. But when you build a product, you need to define what the boundaries of that product are going to be, and you have to be willing to accept that this is the hard part. Willing to accept the fact that there is a difference between what the customer ideally would want your product to be and what it actually is, and yet it's good enough anyway, right? And like I can't emphasize this point enough, right? Because if you're used to saying yes to all these kinds of client requests, like let's say you get a bunch of RFPs in the door and you figure out what you're going to say yes to and no to, et cetera, and then you go build those things. The way that you're operating as a company is you're saying, first, we're going to meet our would-be customer. Then we're going to learn what they need. Then we're going to go build what they need. And then we're going to deliver it. And then they're going to pay us. And the nice thing about that is it's actually really, really low risk, because you're never going to there's no chance that you're going to build something that nobody wants, because you're only building things because you found out that they're willing to pay you to do it. And then they pay you, and now you can sort of support the continued growth of the company and so on. When you're a product company, you say, I'm not building for the customer that I already met. I'm building for the customer that I haven't yet met. And not just one customer, but I'm building for the 100 customers that I haven't yet met. the 100,000 customers that I haven't yet met, right? And so you're taking a gamble that you can figure out what it is that they're going to want. And of course, that might be down the road in the future. And if the market is evolving, you're having to take some bets on how that's going to transform. You don't know that, that every customer has unique requirements and things like that. But I do this thing when I get up on stage and talk at a product conference or something like that. And I say, everybody, hold up your phone. And, everybody holds up their phone or whatever. And I say, keep it held up if you would have traded a larger screen for less battery life. And half the people do and half the people don't. Keep it held up. Okay, now hold it up if you would have traded, a lower price for a smaller screen. And, some people do, some people don't, things like that. And my point is, you all held it up at some point because it wasn't exactly what you wanted it to be. And yet you're holding that phone in your hand anyway. In other words, you bought it regardless of that, right? And you're still happy with it. And the benefits you got is when you went into the store, it was available right then. You didn't have it custom made for you, right? Like it was ready to go. The price point was lower. App designers could build apps that fit on the size of your phone because it was like standardized, right? And so the standardization of the solution and the benefits that comes for the customer outweighs the fact that it's not exactly the way that I would have wanted. And that's totally fine. And that's a handshake that between the business and the customer you end up with. But what that translates to is that customers are going to say, hey, I wish that the screen was bigger. I wish that, this or that, and whatever that means in your product. And you're going to have to say, no, we're not going to go do that. This product is what we want it to be. We're not building for customer solution fit. We're building for product market fit. Mm-hmm. And those two things are radically different. And the only way to get to product market fit is to be willing to have the product be one size fits all to at least some limited extent, to meet some fraction of the market. And it means that somebody else might be outside your target market and they may have some random, request for your product. And you say, what, it would actually be a bad thing to add that. Yes, I'll get you as a customer, but I'm going to dilute the quality of the experience for everybody else. So it's so important that now you take on all these things like defining who the target market actually is and figuring out where you're going to say yes and where you're going to say no and what the scope and the boundaries are around this, et cetera. And now suddenly there's this whole variety of new things that are questions that should be getting asked between CEO, CTO, and anybody else that lives in between, including perhaps a CPO if the company happens to have one.
Mm-hmm. And you touched on persona so many times there. And I've seen kind of two, the two ends of the spectrum are folks who don't believe in it. And that's maybe kind of what you alluded to in the earlier days, the highest paid person and their instincts and whatever notion they have that consciously or subconsciously they have of who they're building for. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there's a very dogmatic approach where you can spend the entire time, you blow through your entire funding just defining your persona hypothetically. And there's a minimum effective dose, right? An 80-20 rule. And what do you advise people in terms of like, hey, this is good enough for your V1 of your persona. Go do the next thing versus spending more time here. How do you know if they have enough there?
Yeah, what I usually recommend doing is there's an iterative approach that you can take, and it comes through customer research. So find people who you think are within your target market. Start talking to them. Ask them the different kinds of questions on what they're looking for in a solution, what would need to be better than the other solution that they currently have, all the kind of standard questions that you might have to kind of ensure that you're on the right path towards product market fit if you could actually solve their problems for them. And as you have those conversations, usually what happens is you run into some point where you start to see convergence of what those people are saying, right? Like you're not hearing anything new anymore, right? And it's just maybe it's a different combination of things, but it's all stuff that you've kind of like pretty much heard before already. And you can almost think of this as think about like putting it on paper, like a scatter plot or something like that. It could be really wide and all over the place, or it could be like really narrow and condensed where there's a lot of like very common desires. And that means that there's a very rich untapped need, and you can build one little product that's going to kind of like contain all those people. Or if you find that it's really scattered all over the place, it's going to be hard to build like one single product that actually matches all of their needs. And what that means is, it's not to say it's a problem. It just means you need to narrow your target market, choose some subset of that, and then say, okay, I only want to talk to people who look like this. And you keep doing it until you finally arrive at this sort of like narrower version of a target market that you can like get to product market fit on. And then as you mature as a company, once you've nailed product market fit for this group, even as small as it may be, you then find yourself in a position where you can iterate. You can say, okay, well, now that we've got product market fit here, how do we then expand our market? And if I expand the market, what do I need to do differently with the product? And you keep kind of like, doing that to go, broad scale. But I think so many companies are so excited, so many founders are so excited to go meet this sort of like, vision that they had of, meeting the needs of the super broad, total addressable market that they've defined. And they end up doing themselves the biggest disservice because they're forced to dilute the product. So there's the wrong answer for everyone, as opposed to being the right answer for some.
So coming back to teams, okay, so a few things to wrap up here. You've co-authored a book. Did you bring any like very product framework things to authoring? Did you blow up your editor's brains with that, or how did that all go?
It was actually self-published, so we didn't really have an editor. We did the whole thing ourselves. I think that I wish we had one because it would have been really helpful. To have somebody poke holes and just it gets better when somebody's scrutinizing it with a fine-tooth comb. But I think it turned out well, and the process that we used was in a lot of ways very similar to the process of building a product. You put something out there, you get some feedback from it, you share it with the people that you're close with, and you continue to iterate. You read it over yourself, and you say, "Wait, this doesn't actually flow." But I think the key was just having a really high bar for quality, and also understanding what we wanted to do that was going to be differentiated. There's not a huge number of books on product that are out there, but there are a decent number, and the thing that we really wanted to differentiate it on is we'd read so many books that were like, they talk about things at a high level, and they're all things that I would agree with. Like, they're great. They're like, you should have outcomes matter more than output, or, empowered teams are really important and things like that. It's like, okay, but how do I actually get to do that? Like, what are the specific things that I'm supposed to put in place? Do you have any examples that you can share, et cetera? And so we really tried to overemphasize that, and, riddled within the book are examples of case studies from our own advisory work or examples from our own careers. We try to be very specific with particular recommendations to make of, the cadence of specific meetings that you could have, or how far out you should look when it comes to a product vision and things like that, to try to answer some of those like ambiguous questions that are like the next stage after you like nod your head up and down reading saying, oh, that's really good, but then you can't really put it in place. That's what we've always been about at Prodify, is just being very practical.
Awesome. Last few questions. What is a recent favorite product unboxing, hardware, not hardware, that you've had?
That's a good question. Favorite unboxing experience recently. Boy, I guess you're calling attention to the fact that I'm kind of stuck in my ways right now. I should probably have more of these experiences to share. I guess the experience, my wife just recently got on Whoop, and I think that there's a really nice kind of like experience there of it's polished and it's pretty and things like that. But at the same time, it's not about the box itself. Like, you literally, it's a box that is intended to be recycled, and it was, built with sustainability in mind, and, things like that as well. But it really focuses the attention, I think, on where it needs to be focused, as opposed to, just being a big advertisement for all the features that are available. And, so much of, I think the modern unboxing experiences that have been really good, are these ones where it's not about having like this great booklet or this physical experience. It's about the combination of the experience between the physical materials that are included and the onboarding experience that kind of like follows from that when you start to use the software. And I've really kind of gotten excited in thinking about what those experiences could look like and how you can, rethink them. You're talking about IoT earlier and things like that. And I think there's just a lot of like really neat things that you could start to do to show people the power of what they've bought without necessarily intimidating them with, half an hour of stuff they need to learn on day one.
Totally. And the last one here, what's something you're surprised that you're really in the minority? You're surprised that more product teams or product leaders are not doing?
Certainly, what jumps out is the thing that we've talked about of having that established vision or that strategy, where it is amazing how many downstream issues companies run into where, they have like the negotiating table where everyone's arguing about what needs to go in the roadmap and stuff like that. And that's because the product manager is sort of like playing defense when they should be playing offense, right? And like the reason you're getting all these requests is because nobody's excited about the kinds of things that you're working on already, and you got to go build that excitement. And I think that product people often find themselves in this kind of like downward spiral where it seems like there's no end in sight to the barrage of requests and other kinds of issues that are out there, as opposed to realizing that they have an opportunity to play offense and define what the vision and the strategy is, to go communicate it and get that excitement around it. And once it's in place, it's amazing how many of those other issues that you might have been encountering that have been problematic, holding you back, suddenly just kind of like vanish overnight.
I love it. The decisions around what you need to run away from become very obvious if you drive clarity around what you're running towards. Well, Ben, thank you so much. This was super, super insightful. I love being able to nerd out with you here. Thank you for sharing everything. How can people get a hold of you?
Yeah, absolutely. Find me on LinkedIn. Really easy. My handle is just Ben Foster. You can also come to our website at prodify.group. That's Prodify.group. Or, if you want to learn more about the philosophy around product and things like that, also check out the book, Build What Matters. It's available on Amazon.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ben.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you for joining me on the Convergence podcast today. Subscribe to the Convergence podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your content. If you're listening and found this helpful, please give us a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, hit that like button and tell me what you think about what you heard today.